Well, thank you all for having me today, and thank you in particular to Julie Napolin for inviting me. I wish I could be there in person, but this is the next best thing. So it's a pleasure to be there with you, if only virtually. As Jürgen said, my presentation will focus on principles and standards of academic governance, AAUP supported principles and standards of governance, many of which I was pleased to see are incorporated into your faculty senate's shared governance principles document. So I'll cover two main topics, two actually policy statements that you can find in the so-called Red Book, our policy documents and reports. This is a collection of a little over 80 of the AAUP's most important policy documents and reports. And two of those I think are particularly pertinent to your Faculty Governance Day. The first is the Statement on Government of Colleges and Universities. And the second one that I won't come to until the very end of this presentation is on the relationship of faculty governance to academic freedom. It's important to point out or to remind everyone that the AAUP, from its very founding in 1915, was concerned about the faculty's role in institutional decision-making. So this quotation from the 1915 Declaration of Principles makes clear that the trustees hold a highly honorable place in our universities, but the faculties hold an independent place, independent from the trustees, with quite equal responsibilities. The founders of the AAUP conceived of the faculty as having this equal responsibilities. And by that, they meant of equal importance. And when it comes to educational questions and scientific questions, the founders believed that faculty should have the primary responsibility for those areas. And as I'll say a few times throughout the presentation, the reason was pretty straightforward and remains straightforward. It's the faculty that has the collective expertise to deal with scientific questions and educational questions, not the members of the governing board and not the administration. It's the faculty that has that collective knowledge. So fast forward about 50 years to the formulation of the Statement on Government of Colleges and Universities, which continues to be the authoritative formulation of principles of academic governance in this country. It's really important to emphasize this was a joint formulation by the AAUP with the American Council on Education, which represents presidents, and the Association of Governing Boards of Universities and Colleges, which of course represents trustees. Each of those two groups commended the statement to their members. This is not simply an AAUP statement. It's well worth emphasizing that it's a joint statement among these three organizations. And in fact, as recently as 4 or 5 years ago, the Association of Governing Boards affirmed that, quote, specific reference to the Statement on Government in the institution's governing documents is an important foundation, unquote, for the institutional commitment to what we commonly call shared governance. The AAUP's Standing Committee on College and University Governance publicly commended the AGB for reaffirming the importance of the Statement on Government 4 or 5 years ago. We often hear that, well, that document is more than 50 years old. Why should we continue to pay attention to it? Things have changed so much in the academy since 1966. That is true, but the principles and standards that are found in that document have not changed and should not change, at least from the perspective of the three organizations that formulated it. Generally speaking, the Statement on Government calls for adequate communication, shared responsibility, and joint planning and effort among the three major components of an institution: the governing board, the administration, and the faculty. While they communicate with each other and share responsibility and engage in joint planning and effort, each of the components has its own areas of primary responsibility that the statement goes on to delineate, and that I'll talk about over the next several slides. What the framers of this document argued was what's at the bottom half of this slide. The variety and complexity of the tasks performed by institutions of higher education produce an inescapable interdependence among the various components of the institution. Those components are inescapably interdependent on one another. The statement recommends, quote unquote, joint governance or joint effort because any institution in which the components are aware of their interdependence and of the usefulness of communication and the force of joint action have an increased capacity to solve educational problems, not only to make the institution run more effectively, but to solve problems that might emerge in the day-to-day operation of the institution. Appropriate joint planning and effort, along with adequate communication. What that means is that all components get to participate, all of them. Important areas of action, the statement says, involve at one time or another the initiating capacity and decision-making participation of all institutional components. Appropriate joint planning and effort also requires participation based on the degree of responsibility. Just because every component gets to participate doesn't mean they have equal voice in every decision that gets made. That's often something that that people don't necessarily believe to be the case. They think the statement gives faculty a voice equal to the administration and to the board in every single decision that gets made at the university. That's not the case under the standards found in the Statement on Government. Differences in the weight of each voice are determined by reference to the responsibility each component has for the particular matter at hand. What that means is that each of these three components has a differently weighted voice depending on the decision-making area we're talking about. So the statement goes on to essentially list the specific and primary responsibilities of each of the three components. And as I said, I was pleased to see many of these included in your Faculty Senate's Principles of Governance document that that I was able to look at before this meeting. The role of the governing board. It has several primary responsibilities, the board does. Ensure that the institution stays true to its mission, plays a major role in ensuring the institution has the financial resources it needs. The board, and faculty members don't often like to hear this, but the board does possess final decision-making authority in all areas. The board has fiduciary responsibility for the institution and does have final decision-making authority. However, the statement is also clear, quote, the board should undertake appropriate self-limitation. Just because the board has ultimate decision-making authority does not mean that it should exercise it in every single area all the time. It maintains a general overview, the board does, but it also, under the principles set forth in the statement, entrusts the conduct of the administration to the administrative officers and the conduct of teaching and research to the faculty. Again, because that's where the faculty's collective expertise lies. So while the board is, in this conception kind of sits up top, Jürgen mentioned earlier the vertical, structure, it also delegates its authority to the president and administration more generally and to the faculty. The president's work is to plan, to organize, to direct, and to represent, as the statement puts it. The president is the chief executive officer of the institution, and in that role is expected to provide institutional leadership, of course, but is also expected to ensure that there's effective communication between the components of the institution. Arthur Lovejoy, back in the early 1910s, early 1920s, famously compared the relationship between the board, the president, and the faculty to an hourglass, where the trustees were at one end of the hourglass and the faculty was at the other end of the hourglass, and any communication between them had to go through that thin middle band, the president's office. And Lovejoy regretted that that was how it worked. He thought there should be more direct communication, including without the president at all, between the faculty and the governing board. In most institutions, that is not the case to this day. And so the president is responsible for ensuring that the faculty and the board in particular are in regular communication and communicate effectively. And of course, the president is also responsible for ensuring that the institution operates in a way that conforms not only to the policies that are set forth by the governing board, but also conforms to sound academic practice. And finally, the president's responsible for maintaining existing institutional resources and creating new ones, fundraising, has ultimate managerial responsibility for all of the non-academic stuff that every college and university is involved in, from athletics to facilities. Importantly, the president, according to the statement, should be equally qualified to serve as both the executive officer of the governing board and as the chief academic officer of the institution and the faculty. Increasingly over the last 30 years or so, we have seen institutions in their searches for presidents emphasize the former much more than the latter. I guess most recently, there have been questions about the appointment of Sonny Perdue, based on the fact that he really doesn't have, according to critics, the qualifications to serve as chief academic officer of an institution of higher education and the faculty of that institution. 6 or 7 years ago, the University of Iowa ran into trouble, including with the AAUP, for hiring a president who had no experience whatsoever in academia, Bruce Harold. He was an IBM executive. He may have been qualified to serve as the executive officer of the governing board, having served in equivalent positions in the past. But the faculty especially had hard questions about whether he was qualified to serve as the chief academic officer of a research university. In those dual roles, as executive officer and chief academic officer, the president should have the confidence, the statement declares, of the board and the faculty. The statement also lays out the faculty's areas of primary responsibility. Essentially, again, the faculty has responsibility, both voice and decision-making authority, for matters in proportion to the degree of their expert knowledge. So, the statement says the faculty has primary responsibility for such fundamental areas as curriculum, subject matter and methods of instruction, research, faculty status, and those aspects of student life which relate to the educational process. These are the faculty's areas of primary responsibility. The area of faculty status in particular includes appointments, reappointments, decisions not to reappoint, promotions, tenure, and of course, dismissal. In these areas, as the statement says, the power of review or final decision lodged in the governing board or delegated by it to the president should be exercised adversely only in exceptional circumstances and for reasons communicated to the faculty. That's what primary responsibility means. It means essentially that in these areas that were listed on the previous slide, the faculty should, for all intents and purposes, get to call the shots. Does the board have the final say? Yes. But the board should also defer to the faculty's judgment in those areas. Why? Again, because those are the areas in which the faculty has collective expertise. It's desirable in those exceptional circumstances when the board acts adversely. It's desirable that the faculty following such communication should have opportunity for further consideration and further transmittal of its views to the president or board. It shouldn't simply be the faculty reaches a decision, the president or board overturns it, and that's the end of the story. That is not how traditional academic governance is supposed to work under the principles set forth in this statement. An adverse decision by a president or board should be exceptional, and it shouldn't be the end of the story. The faculty, as I just said, should have an opportunity for further consideration and transmittal. That, again, adequate communication, joint planning and effort, that's what that means in practice. The statement reiterates that and says, in those areas of the faculty's primary responsibilities, boards and presidents should concur with the faculty judgment, except in rare instances and for compelling reasons, which should be stated in detail. The faculty also has oversight over admissions. Again, who is in a better position to judge the academic credentials of prospective students than faculty? The faculty should set the requirements for degrees and determine when those requirements have been met. Faculties have become so used to the presence of an admissions office and a registrar's office that they sometimes forget that these are actually areas where the faculty should have primary responsibility. That is not to say such offices should not exist. It is to say that the faculty should have oversight over these components of the institution as well. Even in those areas where the faculty doesn't have primary responsibility, and there are plenty of them, the faculty still gets to participate. As I said earlier, all the components get to participate to a greater or lesser extent in decision making. So in these areas, which are not the faculty's primary responsibility, the faculty does not have expertise in these areas any more than the board or administration necessarily, but they still get to participate. So long-range strategic planning, physical plant, facilities. I mean, especially when we're talking about things like renovating classrooms or labs, who's in a better position to provide input than the faculty who actually use those classrooms and labs? Budgetary and salary decisions. There's a separate statement altogether in the Red Book on the faculty's role in budgetary decisions. It should be an extensive one. And then the hiring and evaluation of administrators, especially academic administrators. The faculty should have a significant role in that. The statement on government speaks specifically to searches for presidents. And then we have a separate statement that more generally addresses searches for administrators and what the faculty's role in those should be. Speaking generally again, the statement says that effective planning demands that the broadest possible exchange of information and opinion should be the rule for communication among the board, administration, and faculty. Again, that's that adequate communication and joint planning that I spoke of earlier. And the board, president, and faculty should all seek agreement on decisions regarding buildings, other facilities to be used in the educational work of the institution. So should we build a new hockey rink or should we build a new classroom building? The faculty should be involved in answering that question because it bears directly not only on the educational work of the institution, but on matters that affect students and their educational experience. And then again, back to the role of the faculty in selecting administrators. The faculty's role should reflect the extent of faculty interest in the position. So a vice president for finance is probably doesn't bear as much on the faculty as, say, a vice president for academic affairs. And so the faculty's role in those two searches should be different. But the statement is clear when it comes to selecting a president, that there should be a cooperative search by the governing board and the faculty, cooperative search, taking into consideration the opinions of others. And the president, again, to go back to the president's dual roles, the president should be equally qualified to serve as both the executive officer of the governing board and the chief academic officer of the institution and the faculty. And that dual role requires the president to interpret to both the board and the faculty the educational views and concepts of institutional government of each. And if a president is able to do that, then they should have the confidence of both the board and the faculty. Back to adequate communication, the statement makes clear that structures for that communication should exist and be clearly understood and observed. And the corollary to that is when effective structures don't exist, or when they do exist and they're failing. It's the president's primary responsibility to address that. Academic governance, the traditional conception of it, is not equivalent to a democracy. Shared governance is not a democracy. All voices are not equal in institutional governance. Instead, the faculty exercises primary responsibility in its areas of expert knowledge, as the board and administration both do as well. In those areas of the faculty's primary responsibility, as I've said, and it is worth repeating, the administration and board normally concur with faculty recommendations regarding those areas. That's the traditional conception of governance. In other words, in academic matters, a faculty decision should be a final decision. In yet other words, the administration and board should maintain a hands-off approach when it comes to those areas of the faculty's primary responsibility I had on an earlier slide, some of which I've reproduced here: curriculum, subject matter and methods of instruction, academic policies, admission standards, all the stuff that goes along with faculty status, including dismissal and tenure and promotion, all should be in the hands of the faculty. And then finally, I would be remiss if I didn't at least mention the relationship between governance and academic freedom. Yes, the faculty should exercise primary responsibility in its areas of expertise. That, on the face of it, makes sense. But there's also an academic freedom component to this. The two, governance and academic freedom, are, as one of our statements puts it, inextricably linked. Maintaining academic freedom requires faculty participation in governance. If the faculty isn't afforded its appropriate role in the governance of the institution, academic freedom is difficult to maintain. For example, it's something as simple as this. A faculty member applies for promotion, for tenure and promotion in rank. And the faculty committees that evaluate the candidate recommend their reappointment and the granting of tenure. And the administration says no. Now, that's going to chill academic freedom. First of all, it's a violation of governance principles, of course, because that's an area of the faculty's primary responsibility, and the administration and board should exercise an adverse decision only in exceptional circumstances. An equal problem is the consequences for academic freedom of such a thing. Faculty will begin to think to themselves, well, that person got denied. We don't know why, because they were recommended by the faculty. I think I'm probably going to keep my mouth shut because I don't want to get denied randomly when I go up for tenure or when I go up for promotion in rank. It works the other way too. Faculty participation in governance is protected by academic freedom, what we call intramural speech or intramural utterances. Under the principles of academic freedom, faculty have the liberty to be critical of institutional policies and of the administration and of the governing board. That historically has fallen under the larger umbrella of academic freedom among the American professoriate. While faculty, of course, are bound, including by our statement on professional ethics, to follow institutional policies, that doesn't mean that they can't criticize them. Faculty have that right under academic freedom. And so the best protection of academic freedom and thus of governance is tenure. You know, often people think that tenure is some kind of gold star for being an outstanding teacher or for being a really productive scholar. That is not how the AAUP conceived of tenure, and to this day does not. Tenure is a means to certain ends, the primary one of which is academic freedom, and the secondary one of which is to make the profession economically attractive to people. That goes back to the 1940 Statement of Principles on Academic Freedom and Tenure. The relevant policy documents, and I have shared this presentation with Julie and others, and they're of course free to share it with the entire faculty. These are live links to other relevant policy documents about governance standards, the first two of which of course I just talked about, the third of which I mentioned at one point. And the fourth and fifth of which I did not mention, but are really important policy documents as well. Increasingly, we are seeing faculty being made to sign confidentiality agreements as a prerequisite for serving on certain kinds of university committees. We have a statement on that. And faculty communication with governing boards. Increasingly, we are hearing from faculty who want more communication with their governing boards. We have a statement on that too, regarding what best practices should look like in that relationship. And that concludes my presentation. I hope I've gotten you closer to being on track for the morning schedule. Just to end here, anyone, of course, who has questions or wishes to seek advice or assistance, not only regarding shared governance, but tenure, academic freedom, academic due process, please contact our department at our generic email address, academicfreedom@aaup.org. We are the policy arm of the AAUP, and we are happy to advise and assist faculty members regarding our policy standards. And I thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take questions. I'm not sure how much time there is for questions, given your schedule, but I'm happy to field questions if there are any.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Mike, thank you so much. I'm Julie Allen. I'm the president of our AAUP chapter with them. I was just ear to ear smiling while listening to you. It was just so wonderfully informative and inspiring. Thank you for coming. I just wanted to get us started out with questions, and I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about how AAUP might define the word advisory capacity. There's been a lot of discussion amongst new school faculty. Our AAUP chapter conducted a survey of working conditions amongst faculty, and some of our questions pertain to shared governance. And there was, in reading the narrative responses, we've come to understand that there's not consensus on the meaning of the word advisory capacity, and the difference between advisory and consenting, and how that might relate, for example, to the voting power. So if you have anything to say about that, that would be very helpful for us at this juncture.
Sure, Julie, it's a really important question, and it actually speaks to our statement on best practices regarding communication between the faculty and governing board. One of the best practices that statement recommends, and I can send it to you after I leave this meeting, and you please share it with whomever you see fit. One of the best practices that statement recommends is regular communication between the governing board and the faculty. And it offers a couple of different ways to do that. One is just a standing committee of faculty members and board members that meets on a regular basis. Another is some kind of, faculty liaison committee to the entire board. Another best practice that statement recommends is that the faculty has representation on every standing committee of the board, every one, including if the board has an executive committee. That statement recommends a faculty member representative on each of those board committees. It does not speak, however, to voting privileges for those faculty representatives. It simply recommends representatives, not necessarily in a voting capacity. That's the extent of our policy standards when it comes to not only the relationship between the faculty and board, but as you asked about the kind of advisory nature of that relationship. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it's very helpful. Thank you so much.
Okay, sure.
We have some questions coming in from the chat, and then I think we can turn it over to people here as well. Adam Brent asked, how do we balance academic freedom with the moving target of institutional need?
I missed the second part. How do we balance academic freedom with the moving target of?
The moving target of institutional need. I don't quite know what Adam means by that, but.
Institutional need. Well, academic freedom, from the AUP's perspective, academic freedom shouldn't be balanced against anything really. Academic freedom is in the nature of being an academic. The whole purpose of having academic freedom is to pursue knowledge and to pursue truth for the common good. Now, faculty members can't do that if they don't enjoy academic freedom. And faculty members can't enjoy academic freedom if they don't have tenure. So I guess from the AUP's perspective, I would say that institutional need is always going to be a moving target, whether it's the need for more or fewer students or more money or more classes or more faculty. Institutional need is always going to be in flux, seems to me. But academic freedom should always be the foundation for any faculty at any college or university in this country. I'm not sure if that answers the question.
No, that's very helpful, because I can see, for example, someone is hired to teach one thing, but their interest in research taken in another direction. Another question coming in from the chat: how does AAUP view the adjunctification of faculty over the past 40+ years? Did AAUP support this direction?
Oh, we have a number of statements on the role of what the statements called contingent faculty in governance of the institution. If the question is specifically about non-tenure track faculty's role in governance, what the AAUP has long recommended is that non-tenure track faculty have essentially the same role in governance as tenure track and tenured faculty. That is, they should be members of the faculty senate, they should have voting privileges, they should have the right to serve on faculty committees. There should not be any types, under our standards, any types of quotas set for contingent faculty. They should be considered, for purposes of governance, to be full-time members of the faculty. I should also say that there is one caveat in our standards, and that's in regard to decisions about tenure and promotion. Our standards do say that faculty on contingent appointments, it should be up to each institution to decide the extent to which faculty on contingent appointments should participate, if at all, in appointment, rank, and tenure decisions about tenure track and tenured faculty. That's up to the faculty. And that goes back to, I mean, this is all based on principles that are found in the statement on government, right? Any matter of faculty status, including the role of part-time or full-time non-tenure track faculty in governance, should be determined by the faculty itself, not by the administration or the board. Another standard from the statement on government that I actually didn't mention in my presentation, but that is in your faculty senate's principles of governance, and I was very pleased to see this, is that the faculty should determine the structures for its own participation in governance at each level at which it has responsibility. it should determine that in consultation with the administration and board, of course, but the faculty a faculty has to decide for itself locally how it wants to conduct its business. And when it comes to contingent faculty especially, that's for the local faculty to decide, but hopefully in consultation, deep consultation with contingent colleagues.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that super helpful overview. I have a question related to faculty serving in leadership roles and the processes that we have for reviewing the appointment. Do you have any guidance on at what point in terms of either sole decision-making power or authority does a faculty member serving in a leadership role cease to be a faculty member and needs to cede the authority of a person's reappointment or review to the actual faculty committee? So our structure here at the new school, we have faculty committee, we have at Parsons school deans that are maybe larger versions of department chairs, but then we also have executive deans of colleges who also influence the decision before it goes to the provost. To hear that, and the executive dean is an executive dean as well as a member of the faculty. And wondering if perhaps we are not necessarily following best practice as you all have established.
That's an excellent question, and I caught most of it, and I think I caught enough of it to answer it, but if I don't answer it adequately, please tell me. We actually, the AAUP defines faculty status, not in a very specific way, but specific enough, I think, to give you some guidance. And it's in our statement actually on professional librarians, which is also in the Red Book. And what that statement says is that it's not your title that gives you faculty status. It's the responsibilities of your position. So if you're teaching and conducting research at a professional level, the AAUP considers you to be a faculty member. If you are teaching one course a year and the rest of your time is devoted to administrative responsibilities, the AAUP would not consider you to be a faculty member for the purpose of participating in, as I think you asked about, like tenure and promotion review. When we talk about that and other matters of faculty status being an area of the faculty's primary responsibility, the faculty we're talking about there are individuals who are devoting at least half of their time to teaching and research at a professional level. That's typically what we've seen in terms of a standard where one exists. That's typically what it's been. Most institutions seem to consider people who are devoting at least half of their time to teaching and research as faculty members.
Great, thank you so much, Mike. We're going to move on to the next part of our program. I'm going to introduce Simone Douglas, one of the co-chairs of the Senate, who will then be introducing our provost, Renee White. Mike, thank you so much. I know you have to sign off.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Take care and enjoy the rest of the program.